On a warm afternoon in 1966, in a rented lot in Gardena, California, a man named Joseph Popp rolled out a modified Volvo engine. No fuel line, no exhaust pipe. The cylinders were welded shut and filled with a mixture of noble gases: helium, neon, krypton, xenon. Gases that do not burn, gases that do not react, gases that, according to every textbook on thermodynamics, cannot produce mechanical work inside a sealed chamber. The engine ran, the pistons cycled, the crankshaft turned. No fuel was consumed, no exhaust left the chamber. About a dozen people were watching. Among them sat Richard Feynman, Nobel laureate, one of the sharpest physicists alive. Feynman watched for several minutes. Then he walked to the back of the machine and pulled the power cable from the wall. If the engine was real, it would keep running. If it was a trick, it would stop. It exploded. One man, Jack Hartman, collapsed from a cardiac arrest and died on the spot. Several others were wounded by shrapnel. The lawsuits dragged on for years. Caltech settled out of court, and the device that was supposed to prove fraud instead proved something far more uncomfortable. Nobody could explain why a sealed canister of inert gas detonated with enough force to kill. That engine is the first of 10 machines in this investigation. 10 devices built in garages, basements, and military labs across the 20th century. Every one of them claimed to break the rules of energy as we understand them. Every one of them was shut down, seized, discredited, or buried. And every one of them left behind at least one question that no debunker has managed to close. A Hungarian-born engineer with a thick accent and a flair for spectacle, Joseph Popp had filed his first patent for the noble gas engine in 1968. The patent, US 3680431, describes a hermetically sealed piston chamber containing a precise mixture of 5 noble gases. No intake, no exhaust, no combustion in any conventional sense. The claimed mechanism was plasma ignition. High-voltage electrodes inside the cylinder would ionize the gas mixture, causing it to expand violently, then contract as the charge dissipated. One expansion, one compression, one power stroke. All from gases that are chemically inert. David Ansley, an investigative reporter for the San Jose Mercury News, spent months tracking Popp's story in 1989. What Ansley found was not a clean narrative. Popp had a criminal record in Canada. He had fled to the United States under murky circumstances. His demonstrations were theatrical and tightly controlled. He refused to let independent engineers disassemble the engine. And yet, the patent exists. The explosion exists. The death of Jack Hartman exists. And in the patent filing US 4428193, filed years later, the diagrams show magnetic coils wrapped around each cylinder. Coils designed, according to the patent language, to contain plasma and direct the vector of expansion. That is not the language of a con artist. That is the language of someone who understood magnetohydrodynamics. Feynman wrote about the incident afterward in a skeptic's journal, dismissing Popp as a fraud. But Feynman never explained the explosion. He never addressed why pulling a power cable from what he believed was a fake engine resulted in a lethal detonation. If the whole thing was theater, what exactly detonated? The engine was never independently replicated. Popp died in 1984, taking whatever he knew with him. The sealed cylinders were never opened by a neutral party. If it was a hoax, it was the only hoax in recorded history that killed a bystander and survived patent review twice. If it was real, it was a thermodynamic impossibility, running on gases that every chemistry textbook says cannot do work. Neither answer is comfortable. Stanley Meyer was not a professor. He was not affiliated with any university or national laboratory. He was a man from Grove City, Ohio, who spent most of his weekends in a garage surrounded by stainless steel tubes and oscilloscopes. What Meyer built, or claimed to build, was a device that split water into hydrogen and oxygen using a fraction of the energy that conventional electrolysis requires. He called it a water fuel cell. The core of the system was a set of concentric stainless steel cylinders acting as a capacitor, with water serving as the dielectric. Instead of brute force current, Meyer pulsed the cell at roughly 42 kHz, claiming that the resonant frequency shattered the molecular bond with minimal input. He mounted the system on a Volkswagen dune buggy. He drove it in front of cameras. He told reporters it could cross the entire United States on 83 liters of water. In 1996, a court in Ohio found Meyer guilty of gross and egregious fraud. The ruling came after Meyer refused to submit the cell for testing by Michael Lawton, a professor of electrical engineering at Queen Mary University of London. The court concluded that the device was performing ordinary electrolysis and that Meyer had misrepresented its capabilities to investors. 2 years later, on a March evening in 1998, Meyer sat down for dinner with 2 Belgian investors at a Cracker Barrel restaurant in Grove City. The meal was unremarkable. The conversation was about licensing. Then, midway through, Meyer pushed back from the table, grabbed his neck with both hands, and staggered toward the door. He made it to the parking lot before his legs gave out. According to his brother Stephen, who was present, Meyer's final words were, "They poisoned me." The parking lot was half empty. The temperature was near freezing. Meyer was dead before the ambulance arrived. The coroner ruled it a cerebral aneurysm. No toxins were detected in the autopsy. I will be straight with you. The physics here are not on Meyer's side. Splitting water takes energy. Getting more energy out of hydrogen than you put in to crack the molecule would violate the first law of thermodynamics. Every independent test of the cell has confirmed ordinary electrolysis with ordinary efficiency. And yet, the man died in a parking lot 2 years after a court called him a fraud, and his family still insists the coroner's report was incomplete. The timing is grotesque. The coincidence is ugly. And ugly coincidences are not the same as evidence, but they are also not nothing. What actually happened at the Cracker Barrel that night? If Meyer was simply a con man, why were Belgian investors still willing to fund him 2 years after the verdict? And what, exactly, was in those patents that 3 separate foreign delegations flew to Ohio to discuss? On the morning of July 22, 1974, officers from the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office walked into the headquarters of E.V. Gray Enterprises and seized everything. Blueprints, prototypes, lab notes, financial records, every physical trace of the device that had earned Edwin Gray the title of Inventor of the Year from the Los Angeles Patent Attorneys Association just months earlier. The official reason was securities fraud, allegations that Gray had sold unregistered stock to fund his research. No charges related to the technology itself were ever filed. What Gray had built was an electric motor that ran on what he called cold electricity. The engine used a bank of capacitors to generate ultra-short pulses of high voltage, up to 3,000 volts, at extremely low amperage. Inside the motor housing, vacuum tubes with spark gaps separated positive and negative charges, creating what Gray described as an implosion of current rather than an explosion. The observable effect was strange. The motor ran cool to the touch. Wires that should have been warm carried current without heating. Gray invited skeptics to hold the output cables during operation, something no sane person would do with a 3,000-volt conventional system. Nobody was shocked. The energy behaved differently than any standard electrical current his audiences had encountered. Gray claimed the system could power an electric vehicle for thousands of miles on a single charge because the discharge energy was recaptured and fed back into the capacitor bank. In demonstrations at his Los Angeles workshop, he ran a small electric car around the parking lot while the battery gauge barely moved. For 8 months after the raid, prosecutors tried to persuade Gray's investors to testify against him. Not one agreed. Every shareholder who had seen the motor operate refused to call it a fraud. Here is what sticks with me about this case. Gray's motor was seized during the 1973 oil crisis, the same year OPEC quadrupled prices, the same year Americans sat in gas lines that stretched around city blocks. If there was ever a moment when an alternative energy device would attract maximum institutional anxiety, it was that year. The timing does not prove conspiracy, but it does explain motive. Gray spent years trying to rebuild. He filed new patents, he gave new demonstrations, but the original prototypes, the ones that had convinced a room full of patent attorneys, were never returned. The evidence was scattered, the inventor was discredited, and the oil crisis rolled on. Rewind 46 years. The setting shifts from a Los Angeles garage to an airfield in Michigan. In February of 1928, a man named Lester Hendershot demonstrated a small electrical generator at Selfridge Field, a military airbase near Detroit. The device had no moving parts except a vibrating contact called a clapper. It contained a pair of permanent magnets, 2 bifiller coils, and a woven basket-style capacitor. It produced roughly 300 watts of continuous power. The catch: the device only worked when oriented along the north-south axis. Rotate it 90 degrees, and the output dropped to 0. Hendershot explained this by claiming the generator drew energy from the Earth's magnetic field, converting geomagnetic flux directly into usable current through resonant coupling between the coils and the planet's field lines. Major Thomas Lanphier supervised the tests. The New York Times covered the story. The Detroit Free Press ran it on the front page. Charles Lindbergh, at that point the most famous aviator on the planet, fresh from crossing the Atlantic solo, expressed personal interest. Lindbergh visited Hendershot's workshop and watched the device operate. The implication was staggering. A generator that could draw power from the Earth's field could, in theory, keep an aircraft aloft indefinitely. No fuel, no range limit. The military tested the device twice. Both times it produced current. Both times it only functioned when aligned along the magnetic north-south axis. Then, 2 things happened in rapid succession. Hendershot was hospitalized after receiving a severe electrical shock from his own device, a shock violent enough to require extended medical care. And shortly after his recovery, he withdrew all patent applications, signed a non-disclosure agreement, and never spoke publicly about the generator again. Remember that name, Hendershot, because 3 years earlier and 800 miles to the west, a man named Henry Murray was demonstrating a device in Salt Lake City that also claimed to convert ambient energy into usable current. Both devices required precise physical tuning. Both worked intermittently. Both inventors suffered injuries from their own machines, and both were silenced, one by an NDA, the other by a bullet. I have spent more time than I should admit reading the newspaper clippings from 1928. The print is small, the scans are bad. Fortunately, I do my best work after midnight when the rest of the world has stopped looking. And the detail that nags at me is not the NDA. It is the shock. Because Hendershot's generator was rated at 300 watts, enough to light a few bulbs, not enough to hospitalize a grown man. For that kind of injury, the voltage spike had to be orders of magnitude above what the coils should have produced. Either the device malfunctioned in a way that implies far more energy than 300 watts, or Hendershot's explanation of how it worked was incomplete. What was the actual source of the voltage that nearly killed its inventor? Who funded the non-disclosure agreement, and why was silence worth more than the technology? And if the device was a fraud, why did the United States military test it twice? Leave Ohio and California behind. The next device was not built in a garage. It was built under a regime that treated physics as a weapon. In 1942, a German naval officer named Hans Kohler presented a device to the Kriegsmarine, the Nazi Navy. The apparatus consisted of 6 permanent magnets arranged in a hexagonal pattern, connected by copper coils wound in a specific configuration. According to Kohler, the device converted the latent energy of magnetic fields into usable electrical current. The output was modest, 6 kilowatts, but the source was invisible. No fuel, no combustion, no connection to any external grid. The device sat on a table and produced electricity from what appeared to be nothing. After the war, British intelligence dismantled what remained of German weapons research through a program called the British Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee. It was a systematic effort to evaluate every piece of technology the Reich had produced, from jet engines to nerve gas to acoustic weaponry. The team assigned to Kohler's device was not sympathetic. They were engineers and physicists whose job was to separate genuine breakthroughs from pseudoscience, and the Nazis had produced mountains of the latter. Vril energy, Bell experiments, occult physics dressed in military uniforms. They tested Kohler's hexagonal device for several hours. They checked for hidden wires, batteries, external connections. They measured the output. Their conclusion, published as BIOS Final Report Number 1043, contained a phrase that has haunted alternative energy researchers ever since. The report classified the device as, in the language of the declassified document, worthy of further investigation. Not debunked, not dismissed, not filed alongside Vril energy and occult Bell experiments. Worthy of further investigation. No further investigation was ever conducted. The report was classified. Kohler disappeared into post-war obscurity. The magnets were never tested by a second team. Here is the uncomfortable math. The British had every incentive to debunk this. They were sifting through hundreds of dubious German projects. Dismissing one more would have been easy and expected. Instead, their own technical team said, "Look closer." And then, nobody did. Was the hexagonal arrangement producing a real electromagnetic anomaly, or did Kohler simply fool a team that was overworked and understaffed? What happened to the original magnets? And why was a report recommending further research immediately buried? Now, everything I have shown you so far at least pretends to respect gravity. The next one does not even bother. Otis T. Carr worked as a hotel clerk in New York City. His only notable credential was a claim, never independently verified, that he had studied under Nikola Tesla in the late 1930s. The story went that Carr visited the aging inventor in his room at the Hotel New Yorker, absorbing ideas about rotating electromagnetic fields and the nature of gravity, ideas that Tesla reportedly shared with no one else. In the 1950s, Carr announced that he had designed a fully functional flying disc called the OTCX-1, powered by rotating capacitors he named neutrons. The claimed mechanism was that these cone-shaped capacitors, when spun at sufficient velocity, would create a localized distortion in the gravitational field, effectively weightlessness. The device was 45 feet in diameter. Carr told the press it would carry 3 passengers. He set a launch date, December of 1959. Destination, the moon. Price of a ticket, $20. The mission did not happen. On the scheduled demonstration day, Carr checked himself into a hospital citing a throat ailment. The crowd went home. The Securities and Exchange Commission arrested Carr in 1961 for selling unregistered stock in OTC enterprises. The FBI confiscated all prototypes and technical documents. Carr went to prison and emerged a broken man. He spent his remaining years in Pittsburgh, rarely speaking about the OTCX-1. No credible physicist has ever endorsed the OTCX-1. The engineering is, to put it diplomatically, aspirational. The neutron concept has no basis in known electrodynamics, and the Tesla connection, the centerpiece of Carr's authority, rests entirely on Carr's own testimony. So why include this? Because the SEC prosecution tells you something. The government did not charge Carr with fraud. They charged him with a securities violation, selling stock without registration. The distinction matters. A fraud charge requires proving the product does not work. A securities charge only requires proving the paperwork was wrong. It is the lightest possible touch. And it is exactly the same charge used against Edwin Gray a decade later. Forget noble gases. Forget magnets. The next device runs on garbage. In the 1990s, a mechanic and inventor named Paul Pantone built what he called the GEET fuel processor, short for Global Environmental Energy Technology. The core of the system was a reactor tube, an outer pipe carrying hot exhaust gas, and an inner rod suspended inside it. The heat from the exhaust created, according to Pantone, a plasma state in the gap between rod and pipe, which broke down hydrocarbon molecules and water into a synthesis gas that could power an internal combustion engine. The demonstrations were spectacular and deliberately absurd. Pantone ran lawnmowers and generators on mixtures of gasoline and water, then gasoline and cola, then gasoline and pickle brine, the green, vinegar-reeking liquid from a jar of dill pickles poured directly into the intake. In one video, he dumped a cup of cold coffee into the fuel line and the engine coughed once, then kept running. The exhaust coming out the back smelled different from normal combustion. Witnesses described it as faintly sweet, almost like hot sugar. The chemistry is not as absurd as it sounds. Steam reforming, the industrial process of converting hydrocarbons and water into hydrogen and carbon monoxide, is well established. What Pantone claimed was that his reactor tube achieved this conversion passively, using only waste heat from the engine's own exhaust, with no external energy input. In 2004, Paul Pantone was committed to the Utah State Hospital, a psychiatric institution. The circumstances of his commitment remain disputed. Pantone said he was being silenced. The state of Utah said he was mentally unfit to stand trial on fraud charges related to a real estate dispute, not related to the GEET system directly. He spent over 3 years inside. When he was finally released, he was a different man. The workshop was gone. The blueprints had been copied thousands of times and uploaded to the internet, but the inventor himself had been hollowed out. Personally, I think the Pantone story is the most unsettling on this list, not because the technology is the most convincing, but because the punishment is the most disproportionate. A man builds a fuel processor. He demonstrates it publicly. He is committed to a psychiatric institution. Whether or not the GEET system violates thermodynamics, putting an inventor in a mental ward for selling engine modifications is a response that belongs to a different century. Did the reactor tube actually achieve passive steam reforming, or was the engine simply running on unburned gasoline vapor in the mix? Why was a real estate dispute used to trigger psychiatric evaluation? And if the GEET system was worthless, why have hobbyist replicators around the world continued to build and test versions of it for 3 decades? All of the devices so far were built by outsiders, tinkerers, garage mechanics, men without institutional backing. The next one was built by someone who should have known better. Bruce De Palma graduated from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He studied under Harold Edgerton, the man who invented strobe photography. His brother, Brian De Palma, directed Scarface. Bruce chose a different kind of excess. In 1977, De Palma built a device he called the N machine, a type of homopolar generator. The concept was based on the Faraday disc, one of the oldest electrical generators in existence, dating to 1831. But De Palma made a specific modification. He rotated the magnetized disc along with its own magnetic field, rather than spinning it through a stationary field. The result, which De Palma documented in papers submitted to multiple physics journals, was that the generator produced electrical output while experiencing almost no back torque. In a conventional generator, extracting current creates resistance that slows the rotor. This is Lenz's law, a direct consequence of conservation of energy. De Palma's machine appeared to sidestep it. The mainstream response was swift and negative. The American Physical Society rejected the papers. Colleagues at MIT called it an embarrassment. De Palma left the United States in the late 80s, relocating to New Zealand and eventually to India, where he tried to adapt the N machine to power irrigation pumps in rural villages. He died in 1997, alone, in a rented house outside Mumbai. The Indian project was never completed. The pumps were never installed. The villages stayed dark. Consider this. Feynman confronted Papp and got an explosion. The American Physical Society confronted De Palma and got silence. 2 establishment responses to 2 outsider claims, one violent, one bureaucratic, both equally effective at ending the conversation. What makes the De Palma case different from every other on this list is the pedigree. De Palma was not a dropout. He was not a mystic. He was an MIT-trained engineer who claimed to have measured a violation of Lenz's law with calibrated instruments. Either his instruments were wrong, his method was flawed, or Lenz's law has an exception that the physics community refused to examine. None of those options is trivial. A coil, a magnet, a spinning rotor, a dying battery on one side, a second battery on the other. The rotor turns, the first battery drains, the second battery charges. That is not remarkable. That is a basic motor generator. Except John Bedini claimed the second battery charged faster than the first one drained. Bedini, an audio engineer from Idaho, spent 3 decades building variations of a device he called the monopole motor. The circuit was elegant in its simplicity. A blocking oscillator drove a rotor past a coil. At the moment the magnetic field collapsed, the sharp voltage spike, the back electromotive force, was routed into a secondary battery instead of being wasted as heat. Bedini never claimed perpetual motion. What he claimed was more subtle and harder to dismiss, that the high-voltage, low-current spikes produced by his circuit had an unusual effect on lead-acid batteries. They reversed sulfation, the chemical degradation that kills batteries over time. The batteries did not just charge, they healed. Dozens of independent builders replicated the circuit from plans Bedini posted freely on the internet. Some reported measurable gains in battery life. Others measured nothing unusual. The results split roughly down the middle, which is either evidence of operator error in the failed attempts or evidence of confirmation bias in the successful ones. No controlled, peer-reviewed study was ever published. Bedini died in 2016, still answering emails from hobbyists, still shipping hand-wound coils from his workshop in Hayden, Idaho. If Bedini was right, the implication is not free energy. It is something more modest and possibly more useful. A method of battery restoration that the lead-acid industry had no incentive to commercialize. After all, companies that sell batteries do not benefit from batteries that last forever. Salt Lake City, 1925. A basement laboratory. A man named Thomas Henry Murray sits across from a device the size of a suitcase. Inside it, a cascade of detectors made from germanium crystal and a compound of iron sulfide mixed with a zinc sulfide that glows when struck, a material known for its triboluminescence. There is no power cable, no battery, no connection to any external source. Murray picks up a steel rod and begins stroking it slowly across a specific section of the circuit, back and forth. The motion takes almost 10 minutes. He is not generating power with the rod. He is tuning the circuit, the way you would tune a radio to a station that does not officially broadcast. The lights come on. 35 bulbs, each rated at 150 watts, 5,250 watts of continuous output from a box with no visible fuel, no moving parts, and no connection to the grid. Over the next 15 years, Murray refined the device. The skeptic's main accusation was always the same: hidden wires, concealed batteries, radio frequency pickup from nearby power lines. So Murray went to absurd lengths to eliminate every possible explanation. In one test, the device was sealed inside a watertight container and lowered to the bottom of a lake. Cold, dark, no radio signals, no wires, no tricks. It still produced current. In another, Murray hauled the equipment into a remote mountain valley, miles from the nearest transmission line, surrounded by nothing but granite and thin air. The output held steady. Hundreds of engineers signed sworn affidavits confirming what they had witnessed. Gary L. Johnson, a senior member of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, published a review in 2009, concluding that Murray's claims, while extraordinary, were backed by an unusual quantity of documented testimony. Murray's theoretical framework drew from Gustave Le Bon, a French physicist who argued that matter itself slowly decays, releasing energy in the process. Murray believed he was capturing not electricity from wires, but ions from the atmosphere and from cosmic radiation, oscillations that his cascade of germanium detectors could amplify the way a radio amplifies a faint signal. The key to the entire system was a component Murray called the Swedish stone, a small, hand-selected piece of semiconductor material, origin unknown, properties unmatched by any commercially available mineral. Murray never revealed its composition. He never told anyone where he obtained it. He brought it back from a trip to Sweden as a young man and spent the rest of his life building circuits around it. Now here is where the story turns dark. In his own account, corroborated by his son John, Murray was working alone in his laboratory one evening when a shot was fired through the window. The bullet passed inches from his head and lodged in the plaster behind him. He found the hole in the morning. No arrest was ever made. No suspect was identified. The police report, if one was filed, has never surfaced. On a separate occasion, an associate named Felix Fraser, who had been pressuring Murray for weeks to reveal the composition of the Swedish stone, walked into the lab while Murray was absent and smashed a working prototype with a hammer. Decades of work, reduced to fragments on a concrete floor. Murray filed a patent, US 2460707, for an electrotherapeutic device. Engineers who have analyzed the patent believe it contains the circuit diagram of the radiant energy receiver, disguised as a medical instrument to avoid scrutiny from the energy sector. I have read every available paper on this case, and once I caught the scent of the Swedish stone, I could not stop following it. That is just how I am built. The part that will not let go of me is the Swedish stone. Because it is the single point of failure for the entire story. If the stone was just a piece of galena or pyrite, then the device was a sophisticated detector radio pulling ambient energy at levels too low to matter. If it was something else, a natural semiconductor with properties we have not cataloged, then Murray built a working energy receiver 2 decades before the transistor was invented, and the secret died when he did. And this is the thread that runs through all 10 of these machines. Not conspiracy, not suppression, at least not always. Something quieter and more permanent. The gap between a demonstration and a product. Every inventor on this list built something that worked in a room. Not one of them built something that worked in a factory. Look at the pattern. Gray, securities charge. Car, securities charge. Pantone, psychiatric commitment triggered by an unrelated dispute. Meyer, court verdict on a technicality, then death. In every case, the system did not need to disprove the technology. It only needed to discredit the inventor. That is cheaper, faster, and leaves no scientific record to argue with. The prototype is the easy part. The hard part is surviving long enough to turn it into something the world cannot ignore. 10 devices, 10 dead ends, 10 questions that do not close. Which of these machines had the strongest case for being real? Not the most dramatic story, the strongest evidence. Pick one. Make your argument. Best case gets pinned. Subscribe. The next investigation cuts even closer to the wire.